Definitely.
Good morning, everyone. Kris here with Inspired Energy. Our apologies. We had a little technical difficulties this morning getting started at 10. But good morning, Kim.
Good morning. Hi, Kris. Thanks for having me.
Yes, no worries. So joining us this morning is Kim Fontaine. So she's actually a professional counselor candidate, an emotional intelligence specialist, and a host of the Narcissism podcast. So welcome, Kim. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. Yeah, this will be an interesting one.
Yes. So we want to talk a little bit about narcissism. It's such a big topic these days.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you can shed some light on what the spirit of narcissism actually is.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I love the statement of that as we talk about the spirit of narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things if we could just start off, for those who have had interactions with narcissists or believe that they have, it might be helpful to just cover the traits first so that people know kind of what it is they might be looking for before we delve right into what the idea of the spirit of narcissism is.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so there are 9 traits to diagnose a narcissist. And for somebody who has true NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, they need to meet 5 of these 9 traits consistently over time. Because sometimes we all sort of dip into 1 or 2 of these traits at different times in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So the traits are a grandiose sense of self-importance, this preoccupied version of fantasy. So they're kind of living in this fantasy world. So that's fantasies of unlimited success and beauty and idealized love and these fantasized versions of those things. Right. They believe they're special or unique, and that they can only really be understood by other people that they determine are special or of high value.
Ah.
They require excessive admiration. That one's a pretty common one I think most people see. Mm-hmm. They do have also a sense of entitlement, and it's typically an expectation of favorable treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Like that they're the best.
They're the best.
Yeah.
Yep. They are interpersonally exploitative. So meaning they take advantage of other people. So they'll use people for resources.
Yeah.
They lack empathy. That one's really pretty well-known one. And they envy others, and they believe others are envious of them.
So
and they don't. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so when we talk about, having a grandiose sense of self and things like that, or feeling like they're more important than others and they're entitled. So what comes to mind is somebody who's very confident. So what's the difference between somebody who's extremely confident and somebody who's displaying these traits? Is there a difference? Can you tell the difference?
Well, also, you might see a little bit of the arrogance in there, and it's a really good question because it can be difficult to tease apart. Oftentimes, confidence comes with earned value to that, so they've actually earned the admiration or the confidence, because they put the work in to the thing that they've achieved.
Right.
Whereas this grandiose sense of self-importance and self-worth is often unearned. There isn't really any credit to back that up.
Okay.
So but it is something all of these are things that you kind of have to look at as a whole package, right? So you might be a person's being maybe a bit arrogant or a bit full of themselves at the moment, but maybe they're just very confident in what it is that they're talking about today, or they're presenting, or whatever it might be. Or maybe it's just that day. Right. So it really is something for people to look at as a whole and over time.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I think about it, the ones that come to mind for me especially are the ones where there's absolutely no empathy, no compassion for anyone else. What I want is more important than, what your needs are. And their needs are always first,
Yes.
where's my supper? I don't care that you had 2 babies to look after all day. Like, I want my food, right? It's like,
Yeah,
yeah.
that is
Mhm.
exactly it. It's very individually focused.
Mhm.
It's not about community. That is something that I wanted to chat about a bit today too, is that
Mhm.
um, part of what can help to move people towards narcissism
Mhm.
is this, you know, it can happen for lots of reasons. One of the reasons is sometimes with parenting and being overprotective and overindulgent,
Mhm.
and having having that person be really focused individually and less so on community, less so as for other people. Um, and that using people's resources as well, right? Like, you're just here to make my life easier and better.
Well, and maybe part of it too, what comes to mind is when somebody is raised by somebody who doesn't have the skills to actually nurture and give them that love and compassion and things that they really, really need, right? And then it
Yeah,
just carries on down the bloodline, right?
it can. Yeah. And there's evidence that if we grow up with a lot of trauma, it doesn't equal necessarily that people will be narcissistic, but we can learn these traits if there's a lot of rejection, like
Mhm.
that deep sense of not just like, oh, I didn't make the team rejection, but
Mhm.
like a deep sense of belonging rejection to your family.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Trauma, it's neglect, lack of
Mhm.
support, like in really deep, invasive ways, right?
Mhm.
Because what happens, and this leads us perfectly into this idea of the spirit of narcissism, what happens is there's this, and people can use the word spirit, or you can use the word source or energy, or however you want to term that
Mhm.
for yourself, is there's something that can take over the person. And there's usually an
Mhm.
energetic motivator to that. Meaning,
Mhm.
what's the reward? So,
Right.
and we witness it all the time. So people will
Mhm.
say, oh, well, that person over there, when they behave this way, they get the thing that, that they want to
Yeah.
get. So if I just mimic that behavior and it works. So, somebody might start to
Have a
figure out
temper
whatever the
tantrum.
reward is. And it's not even necessarily like a logical decision, right? It's this energetic motivator, I have a need for that. If I behave this way, I get the thing.
Mhm.
And and then what's happening in that spirit of narcissism is they're turning themselves over to this. So it's almost like
Mhm.
they're turning over part of their soul to
Ah.
this energy and this spirit of narcissism.
Mhm.
What happens when you do that and it works
Mhm.
is you do it the next time and you do it
Reinforces
the
it.
next time,
Yeah.
and then it becomes this automated pattern.
Mhm.
And because it is the path of least resistance, once it works and you don't have to, you get better and better at putting the energy into that. It gets
Mhm.
better and better. It gets better and better at taking over you,
Mhm.
right? And you
Good.
sacrifice this part of yourself to it. Um, it's meeting that unmet need or that reward. And so the reason it gets automated is it's the easiest path of least resistance.
Mhm. Well, it becomes a
So
learned behavior, a habit, right? Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Um, yeah. And it's fulfilling this unmet part of part of that person. So then it just becomes part of their makeup and who they are. So people can have moments in their lives, like we look at narcissism as a spectrum, right? We can
Mhm.
go from covert to overt. We can also have moments in our lives where maybe somebody's feeling a little more entitled than another moment, or
Mhm.
we use the example on the podcast of like, your kid's not a narcissist because they're on the diving board yelling, look at me," before they
Yeah,
jump, or
right.
that doesn't make them a
Yeah.
narcissist.
Yeah.
But um, there is this turning over of your design, that
Mhm.
beautiful light and design,
Yeah.
to this unhealthy darkness that then becomes really invasive pattern.
Yeah, and destructive, not only to people around you, but also to yourself eventually.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think about manipulation too when I think about narcissism. It's not necessarily always there, but when we talk about displaying a certain behavior to get a certain result, so people will say and manipulate things, and it's not even necessarily, mean all the time. It can also, for me, it can be complimentary. So it can be,
Yes.
oh, no, you're so good at this, and maybe you could do that for me, but you're still getting that person, you're manipulating them to do what you should be doing for yourself, or, shouldn't happen at all, kind of thing. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. I think you said it really beautifully, that there can be this and that's more on the covert side of things, where you feel it's not so obvious. These sneaky ways of manipulating somebody, and honestly, like I'm really not here to badmouth somebody who might be a narcissist or behaving in that way. There's a reason that's happened, so I can have compassion for that. However, people are responsible for their behaviors, so
change it.
So yes, if you want to change it, and that's a whole nother topic, but they, this manipulation and this tactic, that is the spirit working through that person to gain that reward or that control or that one up, whatever that sense is that they're missing. And that's the thing, is it'll be different for everybody.
Yeah,
it's part of the seduction of it.
So, like, what happens to a person or someone that's under the influence of narcissism? What does that look like? Because I think that we've all seen that. If we haven't lived it, I've lived it. So, I mean, I know what it looks like to other people. But can you maybe, for people that don't understand what their friend that may be living with a narcissist, what it might look like?
Well, I can answer that from maybe a couple of different angles. One of the things that comes up for me when you talk about that is, if somebody hasn't fully turned themselves over to this form of their personality, you can actually see physical changes. So, because part of what we're drawn to within a narcissist, and regardless of what that relationship is, whether it's one we're choosing in our intimate lives, or if it's work related, or even within our families, we can see the divine nature of how that person was designed to be here in the world, and we're attracted to that, where we appeal to that better nature of them, and then you can actually see the subtle changes. You can see it in the eyes. Might see it in the posture, their tone of voice. You can see the moment, if you're paying close attention, where it changes and that influence comes to the surface to take control of the situation, to manipulate the situation. So it can be a very physical experience that somebody might notice. And it can be, there also can be a real sense of distance. So if the narcissist notices or knows in some way, again, this may not be conscious, but they pick up on it energetically, that you see what's happening, or you're onto them, so to speak, they might distance themselves from you. They might push you away. They might do something that, the gaslighting, the stonewalling, anything that makes it look like you're the one having the problem, because you're identifying what's going on in them, and you might be calling them out on it a little bit. They could get into narcissistic rage. So this is something I always want to caution people on, in terms of when you are interacting with a narcissist, to really be discerning about how you approach and what tools you use, because nobody needs to be in harm's way if you're dealing with somebody who can be really aggressive and abusive.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but you'll see the gaslighting. You'll see, if your friend is a victim of a narcissist, their
Mhm.
self-esteem will start to go down. They'll start to question themselves. They'll have trouble making decisions. The
Mhm.
physical response to that, I mean, there's diseases related to people who are victims of narcissists, right?
Mhm.
It actually impacts our brain.
Mhm.
Um, you can get autoimmune issues from that interaction over long term.
Mhm.
But mostly it chips away. You'll start to see the chipping away and the deteriorating of the vibrancy of the person who's interacting with the narcissist.
So something that I don't know if you can speak to this or not, but what I noticed is there's also kind of a codependency that happens in these types of relationships too, because um, sometimes the relationship is such that the narcissist has such control over the finances, over everything in that person's life, that it becomes very codependent on the victim's part, where they're like relying on, that person to support them, or, and they find it difficult to leave, and you just find them wasting away and, not becoming that person that you know them to be. Is that kind of a thing too, or?
That's speaking exactly to what we're talking about with this idea that your confidence gets chipped away at, your self-esteem gets chipped away at when you're in that kind of relationship. So you
Mhm.
lose this idea that you know how to make appropriate decisions for yourself or for others, that you're smart enough, you're good enough, you're beautiful enough, whatever it might be. So you turn over your autonomy to
Mhm.
this other person because they've deteriorated your sense of self-worth enough that you actually start to self-gaslight and you're believing the stories that they're putting out. So that will happen. Like they have to do less work over time because if you've been on the other side of it, you start to do the self-gaslighting. You
Mhm.
start to do you start to do all of the destructive thoughts and patterns and behaviors that they've instilled, that they've made you believe, that they're the
Mhm.
ones that can make the better decisions. They're the ones that can make um, that just know better. They know the right thing to do, and when you
Mhm.
do it, you're somehow wrong.
Yeah, like you can't trust your thoughts anymore. You don't know what's yours and what's somebody else's anymore, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And
Mhm.
you tend to start to check yourself a lot with other people. Like, is
Uh,
this okay? Is that okay? Is this what I should do or shouldn't do? Is this what you need or what you don't need? As opposed
mhm.
to just being able to take action and decide for yourself.
Right. And
Yeah.
I noticed too, somebody who's very apologetic. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And they're apologizing for absolutely everything. Like, even when it has nothing to do with them, they're saying they're sorry. And this is, a pattern for somebody who's kind of been through any type of narcissistic abuse or even physical abuse, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, I do. I think you're right. It can bridge lots of different forms of trauma and abuse, but certainly You'll see it show up in that way as well.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So the cycle of narcissism,
Yeah,
which might be helpful for people to identify, what is that cycle? What does it look like?
we touched on it a little bit, but yes, I'll get to it.
Mhm.
And it's also, I'll point out the fact that the cycle that I'm talking about is the cycle not only for the narcissist when they started to use these patterns, when they
Mhm.
started to be enticed by the power of narcissism, but it's
Mhm.
also the experience you'll have when you're interacting with a narcissist. And that
Mhm.
is that it starts out with seduction.
Mm.
So what they know how to draw you in. They're very, very skilled at identifying what you need up front,
Mhm.
early on.
Mhm.
So it's seductive. Also, from the narcissist perspective,
Mhm.
the behavior is seductive because it's potentially going to get them what they want.
Yeah. Mhm.
Then, from that seduction, it moves into deception,
Mhm.
and like you were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
So somebody who's interacting with a narcissist will experience a lot of lies, deceit, deception, a lot of manipulation, a lot of making mountains out of molehills and molehills out of mountains,
Mhm.
and just a lot of questioning reality.
Right.
And then it cycles into destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Is destruction of yourself. I would argue that it's not full destruction. You can certainly recover it, but it feels like you've lost part of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Destructive to relationships, destructive to outcomes of your life,
Mm-hmm.
destructive to finances. It will form up in many ways depending on the individual's experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So, and then destruction on the narcissist part, because they have now, if it has been this invasive pattern for them, they've now turned themselves over so much to this spirit of narcissism
Mm-hmm.
that they've lost the opportunity, or delayed, essentially, the opportunity for them to see what was really going on that led them down this path.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, and they've become very off course of who they were designed to be.
Yeah. And I think it's difficult to, unless they recognize that there's something that they need to fix, you'll never get them to even look at themselves. Um, so I'm just speaking from mine when I was married, and it was like, okay, well, this is broken. Do you want to go to counseling? Do you want to fix it? No, I don't. You go, because there's something wrong with you. So it was all like one sided. It was all me and not them. Um, and still, like, they regret the relationship splitting up, but they'll never admit that there was something that they needed to work on as well. Right.
Yeah, that is very, thanks for sharing that, Kris, because that's
Yeah.
so, I think, like a really common experience for people.
Mm-hmm.
And you bring up a good point. So a narcissist typically will not get help. Like the rate of that is very low.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Typically, if they do end up in therapy, I think the averages, they last maybe 3 or 4 sessions. They'll last a few sessions until they feel like that therapist might be seeing who they are and
Mm-hmm.
how they're behaving, and then they will bail. And there'll be something wrong with the therapist. There's something wrong, or whatever. There's, for some reason
Yeah.
that therapy's not working.
Right.
So they'll jump around to a lot of different therapists if they do tend to go, and if they're doing that to, look good in their relationship or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if they have a sense that something's wrong, but they want help identifying it because it must be about something else, right? And not about them.
Yeah.
But they won't last in therapy typically. They have to be very, very highly motivated
Mm-hmm.
to stick to that and to really want to understand it
Yeah.
for themselves,
Exactly.
and to want to make change.
And I think
So
too that I noticed that, maybe you can speak to this, but it's kind of like they know the type of person, like an empath, who is the perfect match for them. They know that this person is somebody that, you know, that they can manipulate, that they can, mold them to make them be the way that they want them to be, right?
they have an amazing skill
Mm-hmm.
at picking out those individuals. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, their rate of being able to identify that trait in someone. And then you have the empath on the other side, who's also like, can cut through and can see the true nature of someone and their design and their beauty, and the truth of who they are, their soul.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they connect to that rather than
Exactly.
connecting to
Yeah.
what's actually real.
Yeah,
So
that's a good point. Mhm.
So one of the things I would point out then, for people who maybe are interacting with narcissists and are on that empathic side of things, is oftentimes what happens in relationship is hope leads the way. Our hopeful hearts are open and
Mhm.
excited, and hope is leading the way.
Mhm.
And we don't want to crush hope, but it maybe shouldn't be in the driver's seat. Truth needs to be in the driver's seat, and
Mhm.
hope needs to take the back seat.
Yeah,
Right? We
this is
want we want hope along for the ride, but it can't
yeah.
be taking the wheel. Truth has to be taking the wheel. So you have to be able to recognize the fact that I feel hopeful about this, but the reality is, here's the truth of what's happening.
Mhm. Do you
So
oh,
make the
go ahead.
decision from truth.
I was just something else that just came to me. And Do you think that a narcissist chooses an empath because that's that nurturing and caring that they didn't get when they were a child, as an example, or at some point in their life? So therefore they can see that, and they are drawn to it, and they really want to open up because that's who they are inside, but this pattern has taken over.
I do think that can happen for sure, right? Some people can develop narcissism a little bit later in life, but there's still this sort of unmet need sitting there. So yeah, I think that's a very valid point, that they recognize what it is that they truly want to experience. But they have developed these tactics, these traits to move through life that really is quite destructive to the beauty of what that kind of love can be.
Yeah. And it can happen in any kind of relationship, not necessarily a romantic one. It happens in families, brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents and stuff too, right? Like,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think people don't, they look at it right now as in abusive relationships, like a marriage or couples or whatever, but it takes place in all types of relationships. Is that not right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You'll have those interactions in work relationships, different, depending on where you're working at, I suppose, work relationships, and certainly family dynamics. That one's really tough. Particularly if it's a parent or, parents and siblings, because then you get the family dynamic that's so rooted and everybody takes their role, and you try to break that apart, that role, try to break your role apart in your family. Not an easy task. It can be done, but the outcomes, because everybody then has to adapt, and they didn't choose that. So, yeah, but for sure. So then you get into these added layers, right? In terms of the different relationships, and of course, different tactics of how you'd manage it.
So maybe just the relationships that you can do something about. So, like where you work and who you get into an intimate relationship with and things like that. Do you have any advice for an empath or somebody who is trying to get into a relationship, the things that they should watch out for, so as not to expose their being to that type of treatment?
Yeah, good question. I think boundaries. Oftentimes, people with big open hearts are empaths. We struggle with boundaries. So learning really solid boundaries. It is absolutely okay, and not just okay, it's necessary to say no at times. So, and it is okay and necessary to have an expectation of how people treat you, right? A baseline of respectable treatment. So knowing this about yourself, challenge your own self in a conversation of, what are my boundaries? And it's not an extensive list. It's often maybe, 3 to 5 really solid boundaries that are non-negotiables, right? I mean, we have other boundaries, but these are like the non-negotiables. I will not prep with A, B, and C. And then those have to stay really firm. And then we have the other boundaries of like, hey, I'm in a relationship with you and you've violated this, you've trespassed this boundary. We need to have a conversation and see the corrective behavior about it. So really developing and learning boundaries is very helpful. And being willing to honor what's true and what's real. So knowing what your heart is really telling you, because people who are empaths are so heart-centered, and we lead from that space. And we don't want to diminish that. We don't want to lessen the skill set that is, because it's beautiful. But what we do want to do is balance it with the truth and with our logic. What you're seeing, that is the reality. And so that needs to have a stronger voice in making decisions. And dealing with the heartache that we feel about making the hard decision.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big one, right? It's like one thing to see it, but it's another to say, okay, now what do I do about it? do I want to stay? Do I want to go? Is this, a non-negotiable? Is this something, you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
found that the hardest thing to do is, and to actually feel confident in that decision, because your mind tells you all kinds of stories, right?
Well, it does. And I think our hearts really have such a loud voice.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is, part of why we don't want to hurt the other person is because we care about the other person, but
Yeah.
also because as an empath, we feel their pain deeply as well. So we're not only carrying our own pain from having
Mm-hmm.
to have some hard conversations or make a hard decision, but we're also experiencing their pain. And so we also want to minimize our own experience of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we tend to do what we can to minimize the pain of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we've said on our podcast, and I've said to people before too, is when somebody else is hurting or uncomfortable, and it's really by their own making or just because of life circumstances sometimes, it is okay for them to sit in the discomfort of their pain. That is an opportunity for somebody, that is the moment and the opportunity for growth.
Mm-hmm.
So their discomfort, which is also our discomfort, we don't want to interrupt that.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be okay with other people's discomfort, accept the pain of that ourselves, and deal with own only what is ours,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and let other people own what is theirs. And that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean we're not compassionate about it. That doesn't mean that we can't sit with somebody through pain, but we don't take it on, and we don't take it away, because what we're doing is we're actually interrupting their opportunity to grow and to learn something.
Yeah. Perfectly said. So, is there anything you want to say to wrap things up today before we sign off?
Well, thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
hosting me. Thanks
Yeah,
for
you're
being patient
welcome.
with technical difficulties.
Yeah, no
And
worries.
if anybody wants to find the podcast, they can find that on all of your podcast platforms. So it's Neo-Narcissism Podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And we're on TikTok at Neo-Narcissism Podcast. You can email us if you're looking for a session or you'd like to talk at neonarcissismpodcast@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
And if you'd like to phone for a session, the number's 587-589-8474.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that, Kim, and thank you for
Thank you.
sharing your wealth of knowledge and just being open to be here and actually talk about a difficult subject. So,
That's
thank
my
you.
pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So,
Okay.
everyone who joined today, thank you for joining. And we ask that you like, share, subscribe to our channel so that we can grow it and get more information like this out there. So, goodbye, God bless, and have a wonderful day.